that doesn't reach there. Never mind.
First time presenting.
Shh. Quiet time, David.
No, it's not.
All right. Hello, everyone. I am Joe.
Hi,
And
Joe.
I want to thank Casey for having me. We actually tried to recruit Casey a handful of, 20 years ago, and I think he declined. And I mean, just think, he could have actually made something of himself if he had come worked for us, but alas.
Start out with some burns myself.
Yes.
So a couple things before I get started. One, a few years ago, a number of my coworkers attended a Madison-based security conference, and they went to some presentation by maybe one of Casey's team members. And they came back and they're like, Joe, this guy was talking about tools that you always rattle on about. And he referred to them as boomer tools.
Wow.
And they told me this trying to mock me and make me feel bad, but I latched onto them like, hell yeah, my stuff is actually being referenced, and I will forever call them boomer tools, and my talks will be boomer security talks.
But you're not a boomer, you're an Xer.
Again, shh, quiet time. Second point on this slide, this here was me and Matt Fenfen's vehicle.
It's a Lexus mobile hacking.
It is. Probably 20 some years ago, we were sitting in the parking lot of a large, I don't know, motorcycle manufacturer in some state. And we spent the day there breaking into their wireless. I don't know, we probably got domain admin, but we didn't.
How far we could get.
Yeah, we didn't do what you might call stealthy attacking, right? I mean, it turns out though that if you go over the top nerd, people just ignore you and walk by. Nobody said anything. So, yeah. All right, let's talk about what I'm going to talk about. So, I spent the first half of my career doing pen testing type work and breaking Windows passwords. I'm going to talk about kind of my journey through Windows passwords and whatnot, right? And this is largely a history lesson from my perspective. If you're a seasoned pen tester, it might not be anything new. I'm sorry, drink Casey's beer. I'm going to talk about Foofus.net, what I came from, and what we contributed to things over the years. And then finally, I will wrap up with some of my current work, which may or may not lead to anything. Time will tell. And I should note that really I'm talking about legacy Windows passwords here. I don't care about any of your password lists, fancy stuff, or zero trust, or whatever buzzword is going around today. This is old school Windows passwords. So I'm Joe. I've been called JMK or Jomokin in the past as a hacker alias, right? This was me 20 some years ago. If you're familiar with the internet memes of that era, Domokins were popular. I dressed up as a 7-foot-high Domokin one Halloween, and I think Matt decided I should be named Jomokin after seeing me like that. And I was incredibly fortunate for 15 years to be part of a great local consulting firm, part of an even more amazing kind of security team with great coworkers, right? The Foofus.net crew. And we contributed a lot to the security community kind of over that time. And then it was about 10 years ago, I left pen testing and I joined a different local company here in Madison to kind of try and do things from the other side of the table. I wanted to do defensive controls and be the anti-pen tester. I want to make life incredibly hard for those who come into our environment and try and break it. So the start of my journey kind of through Windows password cracking and whatnot was a post to the NT Bug Track mailing list back in 1997. And in it, this researcher, he posted a patch to Samba that allowed you to supply a password hash in lieu of your actual password to use Samba. And of course, Samba is this open source tool, right, to communicate to Windows files and print sharing services from non-Windows machines. And let's see, sorry. Back when this was first kind of shared in 97, I was just a college freshman, so I didn't really do the hacking thing yet. But I found this a couple years later, and it became the foundation for kind of all of the work I would do for the next 10 or 15 years. So let's dive into a little bit about what made up that patch and why it was kind of important. So when you talk about Windows passwords and their storage on a system, generally you're talking about LM and NTLM hashes. These are one-way values of a password. They can't simply be decoded. LM is the older of the pair. It was introduced late 80s, OS 2, and it had some funkiness to it. So if you had a password, say cricket 8, right? And the way LM hashing worked is that you would uppercase it, you would then truncate it at 14 characters. If it was longer than that, it would just wipe out everything else, right? And you'd pad it out to 14, and you'd split it into these two 7-character uppercase pieces. They then became the key to desencryption, encrypting this magic string they called it KGS. And out of it, you got two hash chunks that were concatenated together to become the LM hash that represented a password. And this was prevalent through Windows 2008, right, where they finally started deprecating it. And it was then replaced with NTLM hashes. And they, again, were one-way representations of a password. And they did away with some of the stupidness of LM. That you could have cricket 8, all you did was MD4 it, and then you got an NTLM hash. And you could have up to 128 characters, you could have case sensitivity, that sort of thing. So LM and NTLM hashes, they really gave us on the pen testing side a couple of kind of key features. You couldn't reverse them. I couldn't just simply get the password back, but I could subject them to offline password cracking. So this is feeding them into tools like John the Ripper or Hashcat and trying every character permutation or a dictionary against it till I finally break it, right? And LM hashes made that really stupid easy because all you had to try was up to 7 characters in uppercase. So the overall key space was relatively small. And to further make it more interesting with LM is that because of that small key space, you could do what were called rainbow tables, where you would pre-compute a lot of what was needed to break it. And then you could do a trade-off of both memory usage, storage of these pre-computed tables, along with computation, such that you could break any LM hash in a matter of minutes. And then finally, the last kind of cool thing with LM and NTLM hashes is that there isn't what's called a salt on them. The salt is this random bit of text that you would add to a password so that the resultant hash is unique in every case. That doesn't exist in these hashing algorithms. So if two people have the same password in 2 different systems, their resultant hash will be identical. What that means then, as an attacker, if I got onto some box and I popped that box and I stole the NTLM hashes from it, I could spray those hashes around the environment. And if I find some other account with that same password, that same hash, I can just use it to log in. I never need to know what the actual password was. So now let's kind of circle back to that original patch from 1997. If we dig into it, this if-else statement is kind of the magic bit of it, right? So in normal operation of Samba, somebody supplies a password and it gets to this SMB encrypt function, which takes their password, does math on it, and uses that to authenticate to some remote service. What the patch did was it inserted this here where it says, okay, let's jump to this P24 piece inside of the SMB encrypt. And we simply skip over the step where that password is converted into an NTLM hash. And it allows the user of Samba then to supply the hash, and it just gets used. It's relatively simple, but highly effective. Now, back in 97, Samba didn't do anything, right? It could connect to a Windows share, but that was about it. But nonetheless, this idea kind of carried forward for decades on usefulness in our tools. This here is our friend Fen, Matt. Matt, in 2003, had a drinking problem with Mountain Dew, it appears.
Shut up, Casey.
So we're now 5 years into the existence of the Foofus team, right? And we're doing pen tests. We're getting pretty good at it. And we've started to actually engage with the security community that was really kind of growing alongside of this team. It was so cool that we happened to be there in the beginning with everything else. So let's set the scene a little bit for what the early 2000s looked like, in case some of you, my coworkers back there, weren't alive then. Early 2000s, we were dealing with Windows NT4 server, Windows 2000 floating around. And if you admined those things back then, you remember that patching was really hard. There wasn't a WSUS, there wasn't Patch Tuesday, none of this existed. You had manual service packs that you had applied. The result was nobody actually applied that stuff, right? These systems were never patched. We also didn't do firewalls, so all of these were exposed to the internet. And these servers installed every service under the sun by default. So NT4 would install IIS, the web service. By default, IIS in 2000 sucked, right? It had so many security vulnerabilities. It also ran as system, or basically an admin of the box. So if you were to exploit it, you own that machine. And because of all of that, this became the heyday for internet worms. Early 2000s, we had Code Red, we had Blaster, Nimda, all of the good ones that just ran across the world, right? And they would infect machines, they would spread occasionally, they would deface a website, it would say, what, fuck poison box or something. They weren't cruel like ransomware is today, which takes down an organization. They were just stupid and annoying. But they spread highly effectively because it was easy to break into a machine. I mean, oftentimes that top line there was sufficient to get into a box. What we're doing here is a directory traversal. So we're browsing to some website, right? And we're saying .. .. walking out of the web root into the OS file system, and then going down, and we are retrieving the SAM registry hive. This is stupid, but it worked. And in cases where it didn't work, you would encode these two values in Unicode, and then it would work again, right? And we would download the SAM. The SAM is the thing that stores your NTLM hashes on a Windows machine. So you feed SAM into Loftcrack, right? And Loftcrack in that time would extract the NTLM hashes or the landman hashes. It could do some brute forcing against it. And if you, say, actually had a good password and you couldn't crack it that way, you at least had the NTLM hash. So we were doing this all the time, and we're like, okay, we have these hashes. Let's resurrect that 97 patch, make it useful for 2003. So we ported it to modern Samba, which at this point could actually do some cool things. For example, here I'm setting an environment variable, which is what our patch did, to the hash, and I'm saying, run this command on my target box. And what it does is it creates this local user foo, adds it to administrators. It was super useful. And that patch, relatively simple, it became the go-to solution for passing the hash for actually quite a few years. It actually, in 2012, there was a cool tool called the Pass the Hash Toolkit. I don't know if any of you saw that was released. And if you dug into the source code, it was actually using our Samba patch under the hood. Just applied it to a bunch of different tools, which was a neat use.
It's still being used on occasion. I know people who still use it.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
They are old, and there's better stuff now, but alas. So a couple of years ago, pretty recently, somebody took a SANS course, and they sent me this image. And I'm like, holy crap, I'm in there. Like, why is this still being taught? But this is super cool that it's being talked about still. Like in 2020, I think, is when I got this.
I took that Sans course 2 years ago, I think, and that was still
I
in
was
there.
gonna say, 3 or 4 years ago, it's still in there.
That's cool, but they should update their material. So stealing a given SAM from a single host, using it against that host, it's cool, right? But it doesn't actually scale all that well. And when we were doing our pen tests, we started to see that, okay, companies share passwords across the board, right? At that time, the built-in administrator account on a Windows machine often had the same password as every other Windows machine built-in administrator. So we wanted some way of effectively identifying those hosts. And there were a couple tools available at that time. The SMB auditing tool, you could point it at a machine, you could feed it a dictionary passwords, and it would brute force SMB. There was also this thing that had just been released called Hydra, which was a brute forcer, and you would point it at a single box. It could do parallel kind of logon attempts to that single box, but really it only focused on telnet. That's all they cared about. But we looked at that and we said, okay, these two things can be merged into something even better. So we took the SMB auditing tool, we created a module for Hydra based on that. We added pass the hash to it, and then we extended Hydra to not just do parallel connections per host, but parallel hosts, so that we could quickly scan an entire environment with the stolen hashes and get into things. Let's see, where was that? Old school Foofus, our fearless team leader, right? So I've been incredibly fortunate through my career to attend a bunch of security conferences. DEF CON by far is my favorite. I have been most years for the last 2 decades. This year is Foofus at DEF CON in '04. And he was presenting on some of the work that we were doing. So around then, we were spraying passwords with Hydra like crazy around environments. And it worked really well, but it wasn't overly efficient. We wanted to know kind of what accounts we were going to hit, focus on them, and be more, I don't know, ninja-like. So we also wanted to know what the target's lockout policy was. Because if you spray a bunch of passwords at a given account, you lock it out, the customer is sad, doesn't do us any good, can't get into the thing, right? So Peyton developed and presented on at DEF CON this thing called Owner. And what Owner did was would connect to a Windows machine, it would query various APIs on it to enumerate data about that machine, including the lockout policy, local accounts, and so forth. If you're familiar at all with Bloodhound today, right, its collection is incredibly similar to Owner. It's using a lot of the same APIs. The advantage we had back then was that you actually didn't need credentials to pull any of this stuff from Windows. You could do a null session bind to the machine. So here I'm doing a net use to a domain controller, no username, no password. That's good enough. You can then, once you null bind, you ask it, tell me what your lockout policy is. Tell me all sorts of things about you. Tell me all of your accounts that exist on the box. And further, it tells you kind of what their password expiration was, if they're an admin of this machine, what their group memberships were, kind of all of this very kind of juicy data. And knowing things like lockout and the usernames allows you to build a much more efficient attack. For example, if a domain has a lockout policy of, say, 6 attempts, a counter reset of 30 minutes, well, hell, I'm going to do 5 attempts, I'm going to sleep for 30 minutes, I'm going to do another 5, repeat indefinitely. It also allowed us to do what I call shallow password guessing, where I will take a very large list of users, try a very small number of passwords against it, right? And around the same era, companies started introducing password policies like complexity, okay, uppercase letter, rotate every 90 days, that just leads to people picking season-based things, so that if you were to spray against a large dictionary of users, a password like winter 2004, you're going to get a hit.
Every time.
Every stupid time. I mean,
It still works.
this idea, right, of shallow guessing, it sounds trivial, simple, obvious. It was a game changer for us in 2004 when we decided to start doing that. It allowed us to stop doing kind of zero-day exploits or trying to do buffer overflows and so forth. We could just guess our way into environments. It carried us for a decade or so. And it also redirected our development efforts onto all password-based things. Because, I mean, finding a 0-day is amazingly cool, right? But it's hard, and it's also short-lived. People patch it. Now, end users picking dumb passwords, that's a timeless thing. Our tools that we built then still are relevant to a certain extent today because of this. So,
Oh my God.
2005 was the absolute peak, I would say, of Foofus.net for us. We had multiple big tool releases, and I'm not talking about these two Dorcases. Christmas time was just amazing. We had a bunch of products drop and stuff, and I think I'm the only one actually thinking hard about it. I don't know if you can see this, but so there's these two knuckleheads, right? And his laptop's there, and it's just a picture of those two on the laptop. I don't know. So the first tool release that we did was this thing called Medusa, right? And it was our vision of Hydra. We redesigned it, kind of wrote it from the ground up. It was modular in nature based on what we learned from Owner. It was pthread based, where Hydra was fork based. So it was faster and it was more stable. And it did SMB, obviously, because I love SMB, but it did another 24 protocols. And it was really fast. Like SMB, we could do 500 attempts or so per second against a host. So here's a quick screenshot of Medusa in action, right? So it's a command line utility. I'm telling it I want to attack an SMB service on a domain controller. I'm feeding it a dictionary called users.txt of usernames, obviously, password of winter 2014. We do 1,000 attempts in about 2 seconds, and this Dorcas Jomokin has a password of winter 2014. So we win. It also tells us he's an admin of the DC. Double win. The next kind of Christmas release that we did that year was something called FgDump. So this is David here, FizzGig's baby. Around that time, there were a bunch of these PwDump utilities floating around that people used, ourselves included, to extract Windows hashes from boxes. The first PwDump actually was in '97, and it was from the creator of Samba. And he wrote it so that he could help people migrate from Windows to Linux and Samba. Subsequent versions kind of changed the approach. They did this thing called DLL injection into the LSAS process, which is what handles Windows logons. And they would inject in there, it'd scrape memory and get you all the hashes. The problem with that was around this era, Windows started introducing something called the Data Execution Protection, or DEP. And when you muck around in LSAS, well, it angers DEP, and you often will crash LSAS. And what happens is that the box displays this message with a countdown of a couple minutes, and there's nothing you can do. The thing's going down. Also around that time, companies started deploying widely antivirus. So we're talking Trend, McAfee, Symantec, and they put it everywhere. I'm not saying that the tool is actually any good, but it was everywhere. It was really more annoying than good, because what would happen is you would run PwDump on a box, you would get all the hashes, you'd move on to 10 other boxes, and like 5 or 10 minutes later, McAfee would pop up something like, hey guys, something's going on, and then it'd blue screen this stupid thing. It would just go down. And we were doing assessments, and we would pop up from the cube and see boxes blue screening, which is not what you want to see. So we had to come up with something to deal with that. And what we did was we released FgDump, and it included inside of it PwDump 6, David's own version. And PwDump 6 disabled dep while we did our thing. FgDump wrapped it. It would remotely connect into the box. It would pause AV, because at the time all you had to do was a stop of the service. And you could do your thing, and then you could start the service and be gone, and none the wiser. And it supported giving a target list and credentials, so we could do password extraction or liberation at scale. It was just this amazing kind of tool. And it became by far Foofus.net's biggest hit. Back in 2005, we were getting thousands of downloads per month on FgDump, right? And on that original website, you saw we had plastered Google ads on there. We were literally making dozens of dollars per year on that. It bought us beer at DEF CON, yes.
So how did you like super user access initially to take down the antivirus to pause the service?
Remote administrator to it. Any administrator account on there could do
Right, 'cause you could
a
just
net
activate
stop.
the system and-
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it was dumb.
Stupidly easy.
Yeah. And there were a couple times where like Symantec would have some sort of control against that, and it'd be a registry key. You'd just flip the bit to security off, and you could do the thing and start it again. I'm sure modern EDR has solved all of this. No, I am forever jaded against AV. I do not trust it for my security. It's just a nice to have, and maybe it'll catch something. But yeah, FgDump, huge hit for us. Dozens of dollars, right? And the coolest thing though was it actually got referenced in various hacker texts, websites or books and stuff. I was reading Mitnick's Ghost in the Wires, and he talks about using FgDump in there. There is no cooler feeling as a hacker than seeing something you were part of in a like legitimate book, which I would recommend this book. It's good. I mean, that tool, like I was there when David created it. We were sitting in some bar outside of Gary, Indiana, and I gave him beers and he wrote it. It was awesome. But
Sounds like a fun game.
Yeah, it was not.
FgDump came out of it. Yep. So 2005, great year. We invested hundreds of hours of work into Medusa, into FgDump, big hits. It turns out it actually wasn't the most successful thing on our website though. That honor goes to FenFen.
Oh dear. Oh, that's right.
This stupid video he posted of him shooting a rock and it exploding got thousands of hits. It was on like various forums linked. It was like the internet meme of that day.
That's a lot of beer.
Yes. Like, why did I spend all of this effort on a real tool when I could just post this? But all right. So 2006, our team is pretty efficient now at compromising Windows, right? We generally kind of follow the same approach. We break a box, we steal hashes, we spray them, we hop through the network stealing more hashes until ultimately you find a domain admin account. And then you, game over, you write your report. And we were writing reports for customers, and words are good, but pictures are better for actually describing the attack path, right? So Peyton Foofus presented at DEF CON this year on the idea of using graphical representation, graph theory, right, to represent security problems. And he asked the community the question of whether this approach was indeed awesome, as we believed, or simply bullshit. And my recollection is at that time, the audience kind of shrugged their shoulders. They didn't really grasp it or care all that much. So from our perspective, our customer base was largely looking at their assets, their resources as just lists, right? But as the attacker, assets aren't a set of lists. They're a set of kind of relationships that are best described with graphs. So this here, this picture we generated around that era, in it, each blue dot represents a unique server at the organization we're assessing. Each little red box is a unique credential. The giant Pac-Man we have, that's because 1,000 systems have the same built-in administrator account password. You compromise any one of those, you steal that password, you have them all. This here is more modern Bloodhound, right? And it's prettier, I guess, than our graph, and it's telling you more than just local accounts, right? It's telling you logged in domain users and so forth. But the basic idea is the same, that everything is interconnected from a security perspective. I assume at this point a lot of us in this room are also familiar with this quote from 2015, that right, defenders think in lists, attackers are in graphs. And I think at this point, really, the world has come around to the original question that Peyton presented in 2005, that using graphs to represent security problems is indeed awesome and not at all bullshit. It just took the world about a decade or so to figure that out and then take the analysis with Bloodhound and things really to the next level. And Bloodhound is awesome. So again, I love DEF CON. And if you ever go to DEF CON, I highly recommend attending Hacker Jeopardy. It is the dumbest thing ever, and it is awesome. Of course, we have Foofus on the end in his getup, Fizzgig and Fen there. And then standing next to the legendary Dan Kaminsky, who was probably one of the best presenters and security educators that I had ever seen. So when we talk about NTLM, really we're talking about one of two different things. There's what I talked about earlier, the storage of LM or of password hashes on a box, right? And then there's also this network authentication protocol, referred to as NTLM. And it doesn't just send the NTLM hash in the clear, like one might suspect. It's more of a challenge response handshake where the client can prove to the server that it does know that hash. And the way it generally works is that the client sends some request to a server, the server sends back a random challenge, the client sends a response, and that response is based on the challenge, the original NTLM hash, doing things kind of like that LM algorithm earlier did, where it null pads it out and uses that as a DES key to encrypt that challenge. And you get this response that you send back. The server does the same thing on its end, compares them, and then decides whether you should be allowed or not. Up until now, we were, as the attacker, the client in the equation. And this time, we decided, let's flip it. Let's be the server and stuff, because what happens if we can get a client to connect to us? We can log this response. You can't simply pass it, but you can subject it to offline brooding and potentially crack it. And the only kind of bit of randomness in this whole equation here is this challenge value, which comes from the server. If we're the server there, well, we control that. We can fix it. The problem, though, when you're the server is how do you get clients to connect to you to send you credentials? And we came up with kind of two solutions that really carried us for a long time. The first was abusing NetBIOS broadcast messages. So the way this kind of attack works is that if you're a client on a network and you want to talk to some server, generally you try to look up that server via DNS, right? You say, hey DNS, we're a server, or DNS says this IP, you connect. But what if the DNS server doesn't know the IP? It sends back, don't know it. Windows, being Windows, will send out a broadcast message saying, hey, anyone out there, are you the machine I'm looking for? So if you're sitting in that broadcast domain, you listen for these requests, and you respond saying, yes, I am the thing that you want to connect to. And if you are the first to respond to that client, it believes you. I choose WPAD here because at least at that time, every machine was always broadcasting for WPAD. It is the thing that Internet Explorer used to discover proxies. And most people didn't define it in DNS. And I don't think the checks were in DNS to kind of handle that that are there now today. So it was a highly effective approach. But then let's assume that we're not on an internal broadcast domain, or we want to be more targeted in coercing a client into connecting to us. This seemingly innocent email coerced more authentication attempts for me than anything else, including many domain admins. The magic kind of behind it is if you look in the HTML of that message, there's an image source link where normally that would point to like HTTP:, right? You'd tell Outlook to retrieve some image from a web server, but if you swap out the HTTP with file : or whack whack, it tells Outlook to come to my Samba server. And my Samba server says that's fine, but you need to auth first. It does, and I log that, right? And at this time in history, people did not do egress filtering. So clients could go out to the internet where we housed our Samba server, and they could hit it easily. And also, people did not do split accounts. So your domain admin was logged in as their domain admin account, checking their email. So if I wanted to break into a company, all I would do is send my stupid question email to the IT staff. I would wait 2 minutes. I would get a response back. I would try and crack it. And then I would connect to their web VPN, which did not do MFA because, again, we're early 2000s. So we did all of this work, right? And we updated our Samba patch to include it. And we released that, right? We fixed the challenge to this value. We included our NetBIOS auto response, and we did NTLM kind of logging of it. And then we're getting all of these responses, so we needed some way of actually breaking them. And we used John the Ripper heavily for breaking NTLM hashes, so we decided to extend it to do this challenge response handshake cracking, right? And we needed some way in John to differentiate the two, because there was already something called NTLM. So we named our algorithm NetNTLM, which was just a name we picked, but it actually caught on. So Hashcat a few years later added their own algorithm. They called it NetNTLM. If you do a Google on NetNTLM these days, you'll find hundreds of blog posts calling it that. That's not a technical term from Microsoft. It's just something we threw in on our John patch. We also posted a rainbow crack patch so that it could use that fixed challenge. Okay, so jumping forward a bit, let's assume that the companies have all solved their weak password problem, right? Everyone has a good password. You're not likely to crack the response anymore. So what do you do as an attacker? You do what's called NTLM relaying, where you coerce that client into connecting to you. You then target some other server. And that server sends you back a challenge. You relay it to the client then sends, okay, here's a response. You send it on to the server. And server lets you in. You tell the client to go away, and you're good to go. So the way this was typically done was that you coerce some sort of SMB connection coming in, maybe with that email, right, or the auto response. And then you talk to a Samba server, and you get into it that way. So people were doing this, right? And there were a couple frameworks. I think 2012, somebody released something called Zack Attack that allowed you to do this protocol to protocol. And it actually allowed you to jump protocols. So you could coerce SMB, you could jump it to HTTP. And that tool, it set the ground, right? It was fatally flawed, but it was a start. And then NTLM Relay X came out 5 years later, and that's what people use these days. And once that was out, then companies started hardening their stuff, right? The way you fix this relay thing is you enforce some sort of session signing. And for SMB, you set these GPOs, you can't relay to SMB anymore. So when that happened, then people started like, oh, okay, I'll bounce it to LDAP, because by default, that doesn't enforce signing. You take an SMB, bounce it to LDAP, you can manipulate group memberships. But LDAP has controls too. So companies have now started to, or at least I hope, enforce LDAP signing. So then what's next? Okay, Active Directory certificate services. This is really the go-to attack, I think, these days that people are doing, right? So if you can get somebody to authenticate, or you have some account, or you relay it, however, to certificate services, you get certificate services to issue a cert and auto-enroll that. And you insert into the SAN, the subject alternative name, some other identity, say a domain admin, right? And you get that cert for that with that SAN in there, and everything trusts that thing. So you can quickly then auth using that cert to the domain as what identity do you want. Here again, there are ways of preventing this. And lots of companies, I assume, are doing that now. You can disable auto-enrollment, you can have signing enforcement, and so forth. So I started digging into this 6 months ago and just looking at NTLM Relay X, playing with it, because I don't get to do a whole lot of pen testing anymore. So every once in a while I get curious and I go down various rabbit holes. And I started looking for, okay, what aren't people relaying to that is still a thing that we could do, right? And I started looking at WinRM. So this is PowerShell remoting, right? It's using PowerShell to connect to some other machine to do some sort of command. And I started exploring that, and there was all sorts of, it was a roller coaster, right? I've like, okay, I have this idea, it's gonna be cool, dead end, oh crap. It's like, okay, maybe I'll go this direction. It was a lot of highs and lows to it. So when I first started looking at it, I was looking at default WinRM, which is over HTTP. And it's on by default in 2012 and later, right? So potentially a good thing. It turns out that while HTTP is unencrypted, the body of your PowerShell remote command is actually encrypted with the user's NTLM hash, which breaks my whole attack. But then I looked at WinRM over HTTPS. The transport layer, HTTPS is encrypted, I don't care. The actual message body no longer is, because they figured it was encrypted at the transport layer. So that's a win for me, right? But the way you deal with TLS wrap things to protect kind of relay attacks is something called channel binding tokens and policy, right? But the default for that is a relaxed policy. If the client does not supply a CBT, the server doesn't do any validation. So I'm like, okay, this is a win for me. But then I started playing with, I'm gonna relay SMB to me and then bounce it to WinRM. And the SMB coming in had a CBT of all zeros, which initially I thought, well, okay, maybe it'll just treat that as nothing there. But it turns out that it just broke the whole connection. So I'm like, okay, another dead end. But what if I can't, well, then I thought, well, can I just strip out the CBD because we don't care? But turns out that breaks other integrity checks. You can't do it. So I started looking then, well, what if I just coerce a PowerShell connection into me and bounce that? Turns out the PowerShell connection doesn't have a CBT. I can bounce it, and this works. If I can get PowerShell to connect to my rogue relay, I can bounce it to any other WinRM over HTTPS service, take over that session. But how do you coerce somebody to PowerShell remote to you? That's kind of hard. And the answer is you actually don't have to. You have things on your network that will freely send it to you. These are vulnerability scanners generally. So my background is in Rapid7 Nexpose. And Rapid7 will tell you that you should do authenticated scanning with Nexpose. You should put domain admin credentials into it. It will then just sweep your entire network and try to log into every single thing it can with those DA creds. And it will do it over PowerShell. And it's not just Nexpose, right? Nessus probably does it the same. If you have ServiceNow Discovery, it's going to do that too. Any of these tools that do mass discovery of an environment oftentimes are using PowerShell to do it and have highly privileged accounts. So if you set up some sort of listener there and you wait long enough, you're going to get the cred, you're going to be able to bounce it, and you're going to win. And I succeeded in my lab of doing this by just patching NTLM Relay X to do that sort of relay. And I was very happy at the end of the day. And at some point, I'll probably post this. I haven't yet because, I don't know, time gets away from you. But so, yeah, that's kind of my journey through Windows password cracking and where I've landed today. Yeah, I don't know. I want to thank you all for suffering through my talk for however long. Casey for buying us beer, because that is awesome, and resurrecting MadSec. And thank you all.
Thanks, Joe.
Thank you, Joe.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Someone has to have some questions for Joe.
I have
right?
so many questions.
You get push that to NTL Lemons like tonight or something?
I will at some point, or at some point, I probably will. It requires some cleanup to not be super embarrassing code. And I think I uncovered some thread safety problems in NTLM Relay X. So when you hit it with a vuln scanner, it's doing a lot of auth attempts at once, and matching up the challenge to the response doesn't work 100% of the time. So I got to figure out how to fix NTLM Relay X for large numbers of connections coming into it. Or I will find someone else that maybe wants to do that part, because I don't really care all that much. But
Just an observation, but when you said like you went to the scanning tools and they gave you all the things so you could proceed. Like I'm trying to shut down my brain right now.
if you have a vulnerability scanner on your network, right, and you've configured it for authenticated scanning across your network, it is spraying credentials everywhere unless you have taken incredibly hard steps and lengths gone to limit where it sprays it. And if you tell Rapid7 this is bad, they don't get it. I have told them this.
Sounds like we need to release a tool to let them know.
I mean, this isn't a new idea. Like, we were running tools like Responder and stuff back in the day and our Samba patch before that to capture scanners that would go across. And some of them, I think Nessus, oftentimes companies would configure it to watch DHCP logs so that as soon as a new client came on the network, it would see that, it would then try and scan it, and it would send creds to it.
But I think that's part of your presentation here too, is what's old is new again, right? There's different variations on the theme, but it's ultimately the same sorts of problems. Just, it's a little harder. There's a new layer added,
Yeah.
or there's a new protocol that's incorporated or something like that, but it's the same freaking problems that keep cropping up again and again and again. You just have to find the new hook, as it were, to be able to get this. This is really interesting.
Yeah.
Dave, I think what you're saying is all these young guys have to keep us old guys around, right?
Yeah, yep. We may walk around with canes and stuff at one point, but that's a sign of wisdom, I think.
We were just so fortunate on our team to kind of get started at the beginning of the security industry, and pick then this Windows passwording kind of related stuff that could stay with us for 20 some years.
Well, and I will say, as someone who is actively involved in this sort of space, stuff like federated identity, for example, these problems are paramount to consider. Like, you have to be thinking about these things, because now we're sharing passwords not only within our own domains, but potentially external domains and such as well. You start screwing things like this up, you don't learn lessons from the past like that, and it's going to be bad. So this is, I think it's a cautionary tale that you're telling, that we need to remember how this stuff came about. It's not that different now, it's just a variation on that theme. So this is very cool.
Thank you. That is good to hear.
Yeah.
And I hope this theme continues for another, I don't know, 20 years until I need to retire.
Until I'm retired, you can't do this anymore.
Yes, then whatever.
Very good.
All right.
That was
Not only Joe, but we got Dave, Matt, Peyton. Raise your hands. Who else am I missing? That
David.
contributed? David. I can't thank you guys enough for the things that you guys wrote, because it allows me to get TA and all that good stuff. Right? So for all the shelling, all the ponage that has happened, it's pretty remarkable to know that Madison area Hell yeah.
Thanks for making it happen, man. Thanks for carrying this forward.
Yeah, no doubt,
That-
Casey,
That's
thanks.
so